October 15th, 1962. Federal Judge Harrison Whitfield had just handed down the harshest sentence of his career. Life in prison without possibility of parole for Bumpy Johnson on federal racketeering charges. It was a verdict that had taken months to reach. A sentence that would end the reign of Harlem's most powerful man. Judge Whitfield went to bed that night satisfied that he had upheld justice, that he had sent a message to every criminal in New York. No one was above the law, no matter how powerful or connected they might be. At 3:17 a.m., Judge Whitfield woke up to use the bathroom. When he returned to his bed, he found something that made his blood run cold. There, placed precisely on his pillow where his head had been resting moments before, was a single piece of paper. Not a threat, not a demand. Just 7 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But what could be written on a piece of paper that would terrify a federal judge who had just sentenced the most dangerous man in Harlem? How did that message reach his pillow while he slept in his locked house with security systems? And why did Judge Whitfield resign from the federal bench within 48 hours, claiming health reasons that no doctor could diagnose? The answer reveals something about power that goes beyond courtrooms and legal systems. Sometimes the most devastating message isn't about what someone will do to you, it's about what they already know about you. To understand what happened in Judge Whitfield's bedroom that October night, you need to understand why Bumpy Johnson's trial was the most important case of the judge's career and why some verdicts come with consequences that have nothing to do with legal appeals. Judge Harrison Whitfield was 52 years old. Appointed to the federal bench by President Eisenhower in 1957. He came from old money, old power, old New York. His grandfather had been a Supreme Court justice. His father a federal prosecutor who'd taken down corrupt politicians during the Tammany Hall era. The Whitfield family had built their reputation on 3 generations of unwavering integrity. Harrison's grandfather, Justice Theodore Whitfield, had written the majority opinion in landmark civil rights cases during Reconstruction. His father, prosecutor Samuel Whitfield, had refused bribes totaling over $500,000 while dismantling corrupt political machines in the 1920s. The family name was synonymous with judicial courage and moral clarity. Harrison had inherited more than just their positions. He'd inherited their absolute belief that law was the highest form of human achievement, that justice was worth any personal sacrifice, that compromising with corruption was the first step towards societal collapse. Harrison had built his career on being incorruptible. In 15 years as a prosecutor and 5 years as a judge, no one had ever successfully bribed him, threatened him, or influenced his decisions outside the courtroom. He was known as the stone wall, immovable, unbreakable, absolutely committed to the letter of the law regardless of political pressure or personal cost. When the Bumpy Johnson case landed on his docket in March 1962, Judge Whitfield saw it as the defining moment of his career. This wasn't just another racketeering case. This was about whether the federal justice system could reach into places like Harlem, where local rules seemed to override federal law, where community respect carried more weight than judicial authority.
Bumpy Johnson had been arrested on charges of operating a continuing criminal enterprise, tax evasion, and conspiracy to distribute narcotics. The FBI had been building their case for 3 years, using wiretaps, financial records, and testimony from informants who risked their lives to speak against him.
But Judge Whitfield knew that conviction was only half the battle. The real test would be sentencing. Everyone expected a deal, a compromise, maybe 10 to 15 years that would allow Bumpy to eventually return to his empire. That's how these cases usually ended, with negotiations, reduced sentences, everyone saving face. Judge Whitfield had other plans. The trial lasted 4 months. Bumpy Johnson sat quietly through every session, impeccably dressed, completely calm, occasionally taking notes but never showing emotion. He had the best lawyers money could buy, men who'd successfully defended senators and Supreme Court justices. The prosecution presented a devastating case. Financial records showing millions in unreported income, wiretapped conversations discussing drug shipments and territory disputes. Testimony from former associates who described a criminal organization that controlled every illegal activity in a 20-block radius. But Bumpy's lawyers fought brilliantly. They challenged evidence, discredited witnesses, argued that their client was being persecuted for his race and his refusal to cooperate with federal authorities in cases against other defendants. But Judge Whitfield had seen enough evidence to convince him that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another criminal. He was the head of a sophisticated organization that had operated with impunity for decades, corrupting officials, intimidating witnesses, and treating federal law like a suggestion rather than an absolute authority. October 12, 1962. The jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts after deliberating for 6 hours. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal agents, and curious spectators who wanted to witness the end of an era. When Judge Whitfield asked if the defendant had anything to say before sentencing, Bumpy Johnson stood up slowly and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," Bumpy said, his voice calm and respectful. "I've lived my entire life in Harlem. I've protected families, supported businesses, kept the peace in my community. If that makes me a criminal in the eyes of federal law, then I accept that judgment. But I want the court to know that everything I did to serve the people who had no one else to serve them." Judge Whitfield listened without expression. "Mr. Johnson, this court recognizes that you may have provided certain services to your community, but you did so while operating a criminal enterprise that generated millions in illegal revenue and corrupted the very institutions designed to protect society. The law applies equally to everyone, regardless of their motivations or community standing." He paused, looking directly at Bumpy Johnson. "You are hereby sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for phones. Bumpy's lawyers immediately filed for appeals. But Bumpy himself showed no reaction. He simply nodded once, as if the sentence was exactly what he'd expected. As the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs, Bumpy caught Judge Whitfield's eye one last time. He didn't say anything, didn't make any gesture, but something in his expression made the judge feel unexpectedly uncomfortable. October 15th, 1962, 11:30 p.m. Judge Whitfield arrived home to his townhouse on East 82nd Street. It was a fortress disguised as a residence. Reinforced doors, sophisticated alarm systems, security cameras monitoring every approach. The precautions weren't paranoia, they were necessity for a federal judge who'd sentenced dozens of dangerous criminals. Judge Whitfield lived alone. His wife had died of cancer 3 years earlier, and their only child, a daughter, lived in California with her own family. The house was large, quiet, filled with law books and the accumulated possessions of a lifetime in public service. That night, the judge followed his usual routine. He reviewed case files in his study until midnight, checked the security systems, and went to bed reading a biography of Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was exhausted from the stress of the trial and fell asleep quickly. At 3:17 a.m., Judge Whitfield woke up needing to use the bathroom. This wasn't unusual. At 52, his sleep was often interrupted, and he developed the habit of getting up once during the night. He walked to the bathroom, used the facilities, washed his hands, and returned to bed. That's when he saw the piece of paper on his pillow. Judge Whitfield's first thought was that he was still dreaming. The paper was ordinary white notepaper, folded once, placed exactly where his head had been resting. There was no way anyone could have entered his bedroom. The house was locked, the security system was armed, the motion detectors would have triggered alarms if anyone had moved through the halls. With hands that trembled slightly, Judge Whitfield picked up the paper and unfolded it. Written in neat, precise handwriting were 7 words. "Margaret knows what you did, and so..." Judge Whitfield felt the world spinning around him. Margaret was his daughter, living 3,000 miles away in San Diego. Seoul was a city he hadn't thought about in 15 years. A place where he'd done things during the Korean War that he'd spent decades trying to forget. How could anyone know about Seoul? How could anyone know about Margaret? And how could a piece of paper appear on his pillow in a locked, secured house while he was sleeping 3 feet away? Judge Whitfield sat on the edge of his bed, holding the note, his mind racing through possibilities and finding none that made sense. Someone had been in his bedroom while he slept. Someone had placed this paper on his pillow, then disappeared without triggering any alarms or leaving any trace. But the real terror wasn't the impossible break-in. It was the message itself. Seoul, 1951, Lieutenant Harrison Whitfield was a military lawyer attached to the 8th Army during some of the heaviest fighting of the Korean War. His job was to handle courts-martial, investigate war crimes allegations, and provide legal counsel to commanding officers making life-and-death decisions in impossible situations. The assignment to Korea had been voluntary. Young Lieutenant Whitfield believed that military justice was the purest form of law. Clear rules, decisive authority, consequences that mattered. He'd enlisted immediately after law school, convinced that he could serve his country while building the foundation of an honorable legal career. In March 1951, Lieutenant Whitfield had been presented with evidence of a massacre that would haunt him for the rest of his life. American soldiers from the 23rd Infantry Regiment had opened fire on Korean civilians they suspected of being enemy collaborators. The incident occurred during a chaotic retreat when North Korean forces had overrun an American position. 12 people dead, including 3 children under the age of 10. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs taken by a war correspondent, witness testimony from other soldiers, even signed confessions from some of the men involved who were horrified by what they'd done in the panic of combat. The photographs were particularly damning. Bodies of elderly farmers, women carrying infants, children who'd been caught in crossfire that wasn't crossfire at all. The images showed execution-style wounds, close-range shootings, clear evidence that this wasn't a case of mistaken identity during combat operations. Lieutenant Whitfield faced a choice that would define the rest of his life, a decision that would either uphold military justice or preserve what his commanding officers called operational security. He could file charges, court-martial the soldiers, and create an international incident that would damage American credibility during a crucial phase of the war. Or he could classify the evidence, bury the investigation, and let the incident disappear into the chaos of combat operations. General Morrison, his commanding officer, made the implications clear during a private meeting in Seoul. "Lieutenant, we're fighting for the survival of South Korea and the credibility of American military intervention. These boys made a mistake under extreme pressure. Prosecuting them won't bring back those civilians, but it will give the Chinese and North Koreans propaganda that could cost American lives." Lieutenant Whitfield understood the logic, but it felt like betrayal of everything he'd been taught about military law and moral responsibility. "General, if we don't prosecute war crimes committed by our own soldiers, how are we different from the enemy?" General Morrison's response was patient but firm. "We're different because we win wars and establish democracy. But we can't do that if we destroy our own army's morale by prosecuting soldiers who made split-second decisions in life-threatening situations." After 3 sleepless nights, Lieutenant Whitfield made his choice. He chose to bury it. The official report listed the civilian deaths as casualties of crossfire during enemy engagement with American forces. The photographs disappeared into classified files. The witness statements were sealed under military security classifications. The soldiers were quietly transferred to different units, their service records showing nothing about the incident. Lieutenant Whitfield told himself he was protecting the war effort, preserving American lives, making a strategic decision for the greater good. But he knew the truth. He had covered up a war crime to protect his own career and avoid the political complications that would come from prosecuting American soldiers. Only 3 people knew the complete truth about what had happened in Seoul: Lieutenant Whitfield, his commanding officer General Morrison, who had died in 1958, and Margaret Whitfield, who had discovered her father's classified papers during a visit home in 1959. Margaret had confronted him about the Seoul documents, demanding to know why he'd hidden evidence of war crimes. Judge Whitfield had explained his reasoning. The war was brutal. Decisions had to be made quickly. Prosecuting those soldiers would have destroyed their lives without bringing back the dead civilians. Margaret was horrified. She called her father a coward and a criminal. She said he'd built his entire career on a lie, that his reputation for incorruptible justice was a fraud. The argument had destroyed their relationship. They'd barely spoken since, communicating only through brief formal letters on holidays and birthdays. Now somehow Bumpy Johnson knew about Seoul. He knew about Margaret. He knew the secret that could destroy Judge Whitfield's career, his reputation, his entire life. Judge Whitfield looked at the note again, trying to understand the implications. This wasn't a threat to harm his daughter. This was something far more sophisticated, a demonstration that Bumpy Johnson's influence reached places the judge had never imagined possible. How did Bumpy know about Seoul? How had he accessed classified military records from 12 years ago? How had he learned about the private conversation between Judge Whitfield and his daughter? The answer was terrifying in its simplicity. Bumpy Johnson had resources that transcended anything Judge Whitfield had ever encountered. Not just criminal connections, but intelligence networks that could access classified government documents and private family communications. Judge Whitfield spent the rest of the night sitting in his study, staring at the 7 words that had just redefined his understanding of power. By morning, he'd made his decision. October 16th, 1962, 9:00 a.m. Judge Whitfield called his clerk and announced that he was taking a leave of absence for health reasons. By noon, he'd submitted his resignation to the Chief Judge of the Southern District of New York. The resignation shocked the legal community. Judge Whitfield was at the peak of his career, healthy, respected, with a dozen high-profile cases on his docket, including several major organized crime prosecutions that had taken years to develop. His sudden departure created a scandal that lasted for months, with newspapers speculating about everything from secret illnesses to financial improprieties to political pressure from Washington. Legal scholars wrote articles analyzing his most recent decisions, searching for clues about his unexpected retirement. Court reporters who'd worked with him for years told journalists that he'd seemed normal right up until his last day, showing no signs of stress or health problems that would justify such a dramatic career change. The timing was particularly suspicious. Judge Whitfield's resignation came just 3 days after sentencing the most powerful crime boss in New York to life in prison. Newspaper headlines suggested everything from threats against his family to bribes he couldn't refuse to blackmail involving unspecified personal scandals. But Judge Whitfield never explained his decision. When reporters called, he referred them to his written statement citing personal health considerations that require immediate attention. When legal colleagues visited, he politely declined to discuss his judicial career or future plans. He sold his townhouse within 6 weeks, accepting an offer significantly below market value from buyers who could close quickly. He moved to a small apartment in Hartford, Connecticut, and lived quietly on his federal pension until his death in 1987. Neighbors remembered him as a polite but distant man who kept to himself, never mentioned his legal career, and seemed to carry the weight of some unnamed burden. The note about Soule was never found among his possessions when his apartment was cleared after his death. Some legal historians believe he burned it immediately after reading it. Others think he kept it as a constant reminder of the lesson Bumpy Johnson had taught him about the difference between legal authority and real power, between having secrets and controlling them. Bumpy Johnson served 15 months of his life sentence before it was overturned on appeal.
Technical procedural errors were discovered in the prosecution's case. Wiretaps that hadn't been properly authorized, evidence that had been obtained without valid warrants.
By December 1963, Bumpy was back on the streets of Harlem, his empire intact, his reputation enhanced by having survived the federal government's best effort to destroy him. Judge Whitfield's replacement, Judge Robert Kane, was more accommodating to plea bargains and reduced sentences. The justice system adapted to the reality that some defendants required more careful handling than others. The message Bumpy Johnson had sent wasn't just to Judge Whitfield. It was to every federal judge, every prosecutor, every law enforcement officer who might think they understood the limits of their own authority. The 7 words on the pillow demonstrated something that legal textbooks don't teach. Real power doesn't come from the authority to impose sentences. It comes from the ability to access information that can destroy the people who impose those sentences. Judge Whitfield had thought he was untouchable because he was incorruptible. Bumpy Johnson had shown him that corruption wasn't necessary when you had intelligence, patience, and the ability to make the impossible seem inevitable. The Soule massacre remained classified for another 20 years, until Korean War documents were declassified in the 1980s. By then, everyone involved was either dead or too old to prosecute. The story emerged as a footnote in military histories, a reminder of the difficult decisions made during wartime. But for Judge Whitfield, Soule was never about wartime decisions or military necessity. It was about a young officer who chose expedience over justice, then spent the rest of his life building a career on the foundation of that compromise. Bumpy Johnson had simply reminded him that foundations built on secrets are never as solid as they appear. The note on the pillow became legendary in organized crime circles, though the details were never fully revealed. It was told as a story about the limits of legal authority, about the difference between courtroom power and street power. Young criminals learned from it that judges, like everyone else, had secrets. Prosecutors learned that some cases required more than legal evidence. They required absolute certainty that the defendants couldn't reach into their personal lives and destroy them with information they never knew had been collected. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the nature of justice itself. Judge Whitfield had believed that justice was about applying the law equally to everyone, regardless of their power or connections. Bumpy Johnson had shown him that justice was more complicated than legal procedures, that true accountability required understanding the complete picture of who judges were and what they'd done when they thought no one was watching. 7 words. Margaret knows what you did in Soule. They ended a judicial career. redefined a criminal case, and demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't violence or money or legal authority. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply knowing the truth about someone who thought their secrets were buried forever. October 15th, 1962. The night a federal judge learned that some sentences come with consequences that have nothing to do with appeals courts or legal procedures, and some messages are more devastating than any threat because they don't promise future harm. They reveal past truths that were never supposed to see daylight. Judge Whitfield thought he was pronouncing judgment on Bumpy Johnson. Instead, he discovered that Bumpy Johnson had been investigating him for months, gathering the kind of information that makes legal authority irrelevant. The pillow was just the delivery method. The real message was about the difference between having power and understanding power. Bumpy Johnson understood it perfectly. Judge Whitfield learned it too late to save his career, but just in time to save his reputation by walking away before the truth about Saul could destroy everything he'd spent his life building. 7 words. Sometimes that's all it takes to end a career and redefine the meaning of justice.